We now will introduce Dr. Anjum. Dr. Anjum, he, mashallah, is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. His work focuses on the nexus of theology, ethics, politics, and law in Islam, with comparative interest in Western thought. Trained as a historian, his work is essentially interdisciplinary, drawing on the fields of classical Islamic studies, political philosophy, and cultural anthropology. He obtained a PhD in Islamic intellectual history in the Department of History, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Masters in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago, and Masters in Computer Science and Bachelor's in Nuclear Engineering and Physics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before higher education, his Islamic training began at home while growing up in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States with a broad range of scholars, including his remarkable grandmother, and continued as he studied fiqh with South Asian Hanafi and Ahlul Hadith scholars, and Usul al-Fiqh and Qira'at of the Quran with scholars from Egypt and Al-Azhar and Syria. He is the author of Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought, The Taymiyyan Moment, Cambridge University Press, 2012. He translated Madarij al-Salikin, Ranks of the Divine Seekers, in 2020 by Ibn al-Qayyum, and it is one of the greatest Islamic spiritual classics, which upon completion will be the largest single author English translation of an Arabic text. His current projects include a survey of Islamic history and a monograph of Islamic political thought. And we welcome Dr. Anjum to, mashallah, address us regarding the history and legacy of Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. فليتفضل يا شيخ مشكورا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. جزاكم الله خيرا. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى، ولك الحمد إذا رضيت، ولك الحمد بعد الرضا، ولك الحمد حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه. Can you all hear me clearly?
Loud and clear.
I first want to begin by thanking the young brother who recited and chose, mashallah, just the perfect verses for the occasion, and especially as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنْهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا لَمَّا صَبَرُوا وَكَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يُوقِنُونَ. We made them leaders because they had two features, two characteristics, two traits, and they are that they were patient, they endured, they had grit, they had perseverance in the path of Allah. وَكَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يُوقِنُونَ. And they had yaqeen in the signs of Allah and the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as we're going to be talking about one such personality in the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is appropriate to begin with these characteristics of patience, endurance, grit, and belief in the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, you can believe in the signs of Allah only if you have the knowledge, ilm, of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And today I want to talk about one such alim, Shaykh Al-Imam Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, rahimahullah. Let me now share my screen. In fact, if you allow me, I will go ahead and share my screen so that, inshallah, it'll be easier to remember some of the points that I make. Of course, as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not take knowledge by taking it from the hearts of people, living people, that all of a sudden they forget what they know. All of a sudden they don't know what Islam is, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes that knowledge by taking away the scholars, the great scholars, who are not then replaced by younger people who follow in their footsteps, follow on that path, and this is how knowledge disappears. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to heed this warning and to follow in the footsteps of the great ulama who have been taken away. And this is a warning really by the Prophet ﷺ for the youth. You see, if you really think about this warning in a hadith, it's really directed toward how we prepare our youth. If our young people do not follow in the footsteps of the ulama, that's how knowledge disappears. And young people who always want to follow the best path, the coolest path, the path that is most valued by the society, and people, young people read from the impressions of the older people of what is valued in the society, and they want to become like those people that are valued. And programs like this, commemorating the legacy and works of great ulama, and certainly one of the most distinguished among them is Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, are really important. So I congratulate people who organized this, and this is the way, inshallah, to preserve the knowledge and practice of prophecy. I'm going to call my presentation about Shaykh Al-Qaradawi and characterize him as an icon of ummatic scholarship. And I will explain why this title is an appropriate description of this great alim, because he was not only an alim, but also he was distinguished from among other ulama in that he was deeply, profoundly, consistently ummatic, meaning in every age, every phase in his life, he cared about the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the people that are sometimes looked down upon by others as the amma, the common people, the riffraff, the ignorant people who don't know. But he was always someone who had one ear to them, to the common Muslims. And this is one of the main drivers, if not the main drivers, of his really significant and long and successful career. So let me begin, inshallah. And I'm hoping that you will have plenty of questions, and that you will write down your questions as I'm going through these slides. Inshallah, we will come back to your questions, and I will try to finish my presentation by 8:45, in half an hour, and hopefully have some time to engage with you, inshallah. So there are many ways in which people have commemorated the passing of Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. More has been written about him in recent months than almost about any other alim who has passed away. Of course, many other great ulama have passed away. And there are good obituaries out there. There are good lectures about him that I'm not going to repeat much of what has been said. I will point to some of the better obituaries and commemorations. Ulama, of course, are worthy of being remembered, and I hope that, inshallah, we remember other ulama as well. However, the ulama, Imam Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, is distinguished in many respects, and I will, here what I have listed are some of the main ways in which people remember him and people look at his legacy. He was, of course, an Egyptian born in 1926, and later, in recent years, when he wrote his autobiography, he called himself Ibn al-Qarya wal-Kuttab, the son of a village and the Quran school, the small Quran schools that are found throughout the Islamic world. And he very humbly identifies himself, even though he earned really all the existing distinguishing awards in the Muslim world of scholarship and reached the heights of scholarship and scholarly recognition. But his beginning was in a small village in the delta of Egypt, and that's how he identified. But he went to Al-Azhar University, of course, one of the most distinguished institutions of Islam. And his scholarly contribution is often the center of this narrative of his scholarship. But he was not only an Azhari, he was also a reform-minded traditionalist. Some people call him a reformist, but I argue that he was still a traditionalist. Nevertheless, he was a reform-minded traditionalist. He tended to take often positions that looked like on the liberal end of the traditionalist spectrum. He tried to precisely because he was close to the needs of the people, to ordinary Muslims, he tried to make Islam, he tried to bring Islam to them in a way that's very prophetic, to show that concern for the difficulties of the people, the questions of the people. Now, he was not always right about it, of course. When I say right, this is in my perspective. I have many critiques. Many other ulama have critiques of him. Most people that you talk to will disagree with him on one fatwa or another. So certainly, this was a feature of Shaykh Qaradawi, that he wrote about most important issues, and he wrote about most important issues for a century. He lived, mashallah, for a century in lunar calendar, and for almost a century in the Common Era, and as such, 96 years, and for nearly 80 of those years, he was involved. At least 70 of those years, he's a recognized scholar, and he was constantly contributing to the discourse of the ummah. So there are many things that he said that people, one person or another, would find problematic, but also most right-minded and most balanced people also see him as one of the greatest scholars, despite their partial disagreement. And of course, that is the nature of our great and diverse Islamic tradition. The second distinguishing feature of Imam Yusuf Al-Qaradawi is his closeness to Al-Ikhwan Al-Muslimun, the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt and throughout the Arab world, and in fact, throughout the Muslim world, Jamaat-e-Islami of South Asia, for instance, and any other movement, Islamic movement that emerged anywhere, looked to him for guidance. And as such, he was able to expand his focus, expand his horizons beyond the concerns of a single alim or a single academic or a single group, because he met so many people throughout his life. He saw the struggles of Muslims in so many different places that, and had a mind and heart that looked to, was full of this welfare for other Muslims everywhere. It expanded his horizons. And you find him on most important occasions in the last century, you find him participating in those moments. For example, when one of the greatest scholars of South Asia and a leader and an inspiration for many, Maulana Abul al-Maududi, rahimahullah, who has an influence throughout the Muslim world, South Asian scholar, when he passed away, it is Imam Yusuf Al-Qaradawi who led the janazah of al-Maududi, rahimahullah. So this shows you the interconnectedness of Muslims everywhere, and the fact that Al-Qaradawi is aware of Muslims, right? He is able to overcome the linguistic and ethnic and national boundaries that have been imposed on the Muslims. And that is why I call him an ummatic scholar. He was a guide for Muslim Brotherhood, but he did not formally accept to become a leader of Muslim Brotherhood when he was presented with that offer. because he saw himself as a guide to all Muslims, and he remained that way. So his reach and his readership, of course, was extremely broad, far beyond any particular movement or country. Another way in which Shaykh Qaradawi is remembered, and rightly so, is the flexibility and forward thinking in his fatwas. One of the most famous works that is very widely circulated, in fact, before the age of the internet, which many of you perhaps don't remember, as the world is globalizing and Muslims are traveling across the world, a new world is emerging. The most popular book that one would find almost anywhere in the world, in any language, was Halal and Haram in Islam by Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, which was translated into many different languages because it provided really a wonderful, an authoritative set of answers that were easy and practical, yet also grounded in deep Islamic tradition, by an authoritative Azhari scholar who has his hand, if you will, on the heartbeat of the ummah. So that is why that book became so popular, and really it set a trend that the fatwa by the great ulama did not need to be arcane, did not need to be inaccessible. They could be easy, and they could demonstrate the flexibility of Islam and its practicality in all times. Another way in which Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, rahimahullah, is remembered is as a global mufti. And this began, as many of you know, he lived in Qatar since 1961. Very early on, he joined, when he was as a young man, joined Muslim Brotherhood and was inspired by Imam Hassan al-Banna, rahimahullah, the leader of Muslim Brotherhood and founder. He was persecuted. He was persecuted under the regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and as such, in prison for a while, and ultimately he had to leave Egypt and found his home in Qatar, and lived there for quite a while. But when Al Jazeera is established in Qatar, which is the first free, relatively free news channel, news and analysis channel in the Arab world, which really had a revolutionary effect on the Arab world. And he had a program there that was really central to the identity of Al Jazeera and Qatar, Sharia al-Haya, Sharia and life. And it is through Al Jazeera and this program that he became a even more recognized figure, a household name, as this program was extremely successful. The other way in which he became a global mufti, and again, as I said, in many ways, he was global as far as Islam was global even before this moment, but nevertheless, these are some of the, in the globalization, which begins in 1980s, in this globalization, economic globalization in the world, as Muslims are expanding and are moving around the world, new kinds of problems are emerging, and he plays an important role in ensuring that those Muslims have a connection to Islam, that their questions are answered, and the challenges that they face as minorities in the West are addressed. So Euro-America, given the cultural centrality or almost cultural imperialism of Europe and America in particular, Muslims in those countries have had a special role to play, that is us. And Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi had, in part because he is outside of his own country, he has he perhaps identified with them and remained in touch. And because of those two features, his thought and his outlook and his reach were all global. Finally, the episode that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of, if not remember, the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings of 2011, when in Tunisia, an uprising starts and then it spreads like wildfire, precisely because of a shared Islamo-Arabic political public sphere that all other Muslims and Arabs are watching what's happening, and particularly all Arabs who could identify with many of these same problems as in Tunisia. There are 20 people almost spontaneously rise up in 22 different Arab countries. Of course, all of these Arab countries are remnants after the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire, this which was, of course, a mark of colonialism. So in a sense, they're really just one region, right? The Arab region. Nevertheless, as the Arab Spring spreads throughout these countries, Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi becomes its big champion and big supporter. And as that Arab Spring, there is a counter-revolution starts among the rulers and Western circles that then ultimately defeats, at least for the time being, the Arab Spring. And that has led us to where we are today. And this, Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi played an important role in becoming the voice of the Arab Spring. He was, when he was the khatib, the speaker on that iconic Friday in Cairo when President Hosni Mubarak stepped down after some 3 decades of rule. Let me now look at some of the ideas of Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, which I will pick from his crucial writings. He has more than 100 books published. Some of those books are great encyclopedic works, and some of them are small pamphlets. So it's very difficult to summarize anything but to his books, but I will try to summarize the key ideas that remain consistent throughout his 100 books. One of the earliest books he writes in 1977, Al-Khasa'is al-Amma lil-Islam, General Features of Islam. You can see that what he wrote in the 1970s remains consistent throughout what he's writing in 2020. And those features are the following. Number one, what you could translate as realism, al-waqi'iyya. So fiqh al-waqi', understanding the reality, was his slogan. He championed this idea, and it became a very popular idea because of him. Many other scholars, many other currents who disagreed with him picked it up and gave it their own understanding, own interpretation. So, but his idea was always that Islam is not an idealistic religion that remains in the books, that is impossible to reach, but that Islam is possible, and Islam is possible today. Islam was not a religion of ancient past. Islam is a religion of today, and that it is possible. That's one meaning of al-waqi'iyya. The other meaning of al-waqi'iyya is that Islamic ideals interact with the real world, and therefore it is very important for us to be good social observers, social scholars of society, what we may call today social scientists, and be Islamic social scientists, if you will. Of course, inspired by some of these ideas, you've had a number of great initiatives that exist until today. I myself have edited as the editor of the American Journal of Islam, and Society Today, which used to be called the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences, a project that started in the 80s, inspired by some of these ideas. So basically, the idea is Islamic social sciences, right? Islam is real, and in order to make it real, its ideals real, we have to study what the world is really like, and for that, we should embrace social sciences. And to the extent that those social sciences have questionable assumptions philosophically, we should deconstruct them and Islamicize them. Second is Rabbaniya, which one could translate as God-centeredness. But also Rabbaniya has a meaning of God-centeredness as well as, what's the word? It has a pedagogical meaning, meaning that Islam raises people rather than expecting perfection. Islam raises and nurtures people. So if I could create a neologism, the Rabbaniya is nurturism in the sense that Islam nurtures. It has those both meanings in Arabic. So that the fact that Islam is both spiritual and God-centered, and that its spirituality raises a certain kind of person, family, community, society. Islam is human-centered. You could say Islam is humanistic, but I don't think that that's quite an appropriate translation of insaniya. But what this means is that Islam is human-oriented as well, takes into account human needs and fitrah. Islam is comprehensive, that Islam cannot be compartmentalized into private life and not fit for public life, as most people were saying, right? In the Arab world, those in the Muslim world, in fact, those of us who are, who've seen Islamic history, 20th century history, until the 60s and early 70s, Islam in the Muslim world had become a foreigner and relegated to private sphere. And that Sahwa, or Islamic reawakening of the 1970s, emphasized this idea that no, Islam is in fact comprehensive and belongs everywhere. Fifth idea, centrism or moderation, Wasatiya, that Islam is a moderate religion, one that does not go on the extreme side of either too much legalism or too much spiritualism without a law, but rather has a middle. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We have made you, that's the middle nation. تَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. This idea is turned into an important feature of Islamic interpretation by Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, following, in fact, in the footsteps of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, and we will see some of the examples of that as well. Sixth is the ideal of clarity, wuduh, and finally, harmony between change or development, tatawwur, and stability or permanence, thabat. And what he's trying to articulate here is the idea that there is a scholarly as well as culture war between modernists and conservatives, and he always took a middle position, trying to take the best from both sides. One important ideal that I thought is an important feature of his writings, that he's not writing to other academics or other ulama, but to du'at, something called a da'i. And da'i is a difficult term to translate, because typically when you translate the word da'i as a preacher, the problem with that, with the modern modern English connotations of preacher, is that preacher does preaching, preacher talks, whereas a da'i, somebody who calls to Islam, calls to Allah, is not merely preaching, which is, in a formal setting, somebody who uses, sonoric, nice, beautiful words, but a da'i takes risks. Da'i represents himself or herself and presents himself, herself to the people, and as such takes risks in calling people to Allah. So I thought that translating the term da'i, as Shaykh Al-Qaradawi uses, it would be an interesting way to get into his mind. A da'i is a Muslim preacher, is an activist, but also a leader. The way we think of a leader, not somebody who wants to be a leader, but one who leads causes even from behind. One who rather does not follow people, but is followed by people because of his or her example or role model. Somebody who has a prophetic character, and this applies to both the ulama of deen, ulama of other fields, and all others. So anybody could become a da'i. And many of the books that Shaykh Qaradawi wrote are addressed to the da'i. These are the specific characteristics that he thinks, that he calls the du'at of this ummah to have. That one, you must be religious. So he's specifically talking about the types of education that a da'i, a prophetic ambassador, I like to call it a prophetic ambassador. A prophetic ambassador needs to have religious education, the education of deen, of halal and haram, and the aqa'id and so on. But also, and this is very interesting, right? To have an artistic education, to be an artist, to be able to express either in words or other forms. He himself was a poet and had a way of very simple and beautiful way of writing. So artistic expression is an important part that is often undermined or underestimated by religious students. Historical knowledge. This is also an important point because Shaykh Qaradawi has an important book called Tarikhun al-Muftara alayh, our history that's been lied about. And in that book, he takes to account some great Muslim scholars who have undermined and underestimated Islamic history by saying, well, everything went wrong after the Rashidun period, and there was, just darkness, and we're trying to we're trying to revive Islam, or that there were only a few revivalists in Islam, and other than that, it's darkness. He tries to counter those stereotypes by actually reading what Muslim historians were writing in his time. So, here he is aware of what other Muslims are writing, other scholars are writing, and he's learning from them. And based on that, he writes this important book that our history, in fact, has a lot more to offer than one sudden rise and then just decline. In fact, there were many examples of great achievements that are truly Islamic, and many rulers, as well as many institutions, whether it's waqf or the practices of Muslims that are worthy of learning from. So anyway, historical knowledge is part of the character of a da'i. Humanistic knowledge, and this again there is somewhat of a translation issue, but he wants people to be aware of and appreciate the human experience without making human experience, as in the modern West, the center of life, and it becomes almost a god for in some modern Western thought systems. But appreciating the human experience and and making dawah according to it is very important. Similarly, scientific and by realism and realistic education, by that he means education in social sciences and facts about society. Wasatiya, I have very few minutes left, so I'm going to quickly wrap up. Wasatiya, as I said, the idea of, literally you can translate that as centrism or moderation or moderate orientation. But he practiced this approach by emphasizing, in every era, and almost every decade, you could see here, there's a new challenge emerging, and he's trying to find a middle path. So for example, in the 80s, there was a problem of was known as tatarruf, or extremism, religious extremism. So there were some people who were rejecting religion, juhud, and then there were others who were extremists in his view. And he finds that the best path is the middle path, that we should avoid those. Similarly, A little bit later, he writes the book Islamic Resurgence, As-Sahwa Al-Islamiyya, between legitimate disagreement and blameworthy division, so that we cannot eliminate all disagreement. Disagreement is legitimate and important, yet at the same time, what are the limits of that disagreement? He, again, frames his inquiry in the same way as part of this Wasatiya paradigm, that we should take a middle path. Know that certain disagreements are going too far, but allow legitimate disagreements and know the difference between them. Of course, Wasatiya is easier said than done. It is a much more difficult paradigm than going all the way in one direction. It's easier, it's psychologically easier for us, but our deen requires being fair and being balanced. Islamic Awakening, similarly, another very important book that was very popular, also very heavily criticized from all sides, nevertheless, one that has had great value, which is As-Sahwa Al-Islamiyya Bayn Al-Juhud wa Tatarruf. I'm sorry, this is a repeat of the first one. One theme that appears in many of the writings of Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi is the idea that Islam is the solution. Of course, this was the slogan that Shaykh Hassan al-Banna had taught. Islam is the solution, Islamul Hal. Now, of course, any slogan has to be simplified, right? Now, there were many critics of this idea that Islam is the solution, but for any believer, any alim, anyone who knows Islamic tradition and takes it seriously cannot doubt that God has given us the solution to our most important normative problems. Yet at the same time, no alim ever said that those solutions are ready-made, packaged, sitting there. I can tell you the verse of the Quran or the hadith that will solve your economic problem or your marriage problem and so on and so forth. But the critics often caricatured and reduced into cartoon Muslims, especially Muslims who were, of course, those who were calling for Islam were often politically disadvantaged, often in prisons, they could not defend themselves. Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi wrote a number of books on this idea of hal, that the true solution, of course, is Islamic and has to be Islamic. Al-Hulul Al-Mustawrada, which is the imported solutions, and how we must avoid imported solutions. Al-Hal al-Islami Farida wa Darura, it is an obligation and it's a necessity. And similarly, other works, Bayinat Al-Hal al-Islami wa Shubuhat Al-Almaniya wal-Mutagharribin. The doubts raised by secularists and westernized folks. And A'da al-Hal al-Islami, the enemies of the Islamic solution. Many of these this is just some of the selected writings, but this was his abiding concern that Islam must remain the frame of reference through which we seek our solutions. Okay. Starting in the 90s, already in the 80s, but particularly in the 90s, of course, the world began to change. The United States became the sole superpower. The world became a unipolar world, and with that became, if you will, the world was no longer divided as it had been until that point between socialism and capitalism. Now the world since the 90s was all capitalism and was global capitalism, and new problems emerged. With that in mind, he wrote a number of books on globalism and how Muslims now, as Muslims are moving in greater numbers to the West and between various regions in the world, he wrote works such as Islamic Humanism and Global Brotherhood, the civilizational dimension of Islam, meaning that Islam could not be limited to a nation state. Islam was, often was being limited by various nation state actors for their purposes. He tried to emphasize the global dimension of Islam. called generally for a dynamic jurisprudence and enlightened ijtihad. Finally, one of the abiding features of Shaykh Qaradawi's works sort of came to a crescendo toward the end of his life in 2011 Arab Spring, when the uprising that probably he was hoping for all his life actually came to fruition, and he threw his weight behind it. And of course, it did not end the way that people had hoped. Nevertheless, it was a very important moment that showed to Muslims, that showed to the world that Muslims are no exception, that you cannot support dictators from, that are all foreign supported dictators for narrow interests of the world elite, and impose them on the Muslims. That in fact, they want accountable governments, they want dignity just like any other people. And that change of paradigm is not something that can go back to older stereotypes. But nevertheless, as this has become clear that Muslims want accountable governments and Muslims want dignity, and Muslims want to hold their rulers accountable, that meant that, of course, the counter-revolution forces had to become even greater and even more vicious and more aggressive. And that's the era through which we are passing. But of course, life continues. There are good signs that in future, inshallah, we'll find a better way, and that many of the writings and hopes of Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi will be there to give us wisdom. For those of you who are looking to learn more, there's no better place than Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi's own website, alqaradawi.net, and his own 3-volume autobiography in Arabic, which sums up his life very nicely, and most of his books and articles are available there as well. So with that, I will end my talk. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not deprive us of the wisdom and the courage of the great alim, Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, and make many like him, and allow us to walk in his footsteps. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.
Alhamdulillah. So if there's any questions, inshallah ta'ala, we can, you can feel free to raise your hand, inshallah ta'ala, and we can call on you. So we have some type of order, or you can go ahead and use the chat box as well and post your questions in the chat box, and we can ask them to Dr. Anjum as well. So bismillah. Does anyone have any questions, inshallah ta'ala?
I can chime in, Imam.
Fadl Sharif, Fadl.
Barakallahu feek. Professor, mashallah, what an excellent presentation. It's difficult to summarize in such a short period of time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you immensely. What would you say is the most significant contribution of his lifetime? Many people talk about his books and of course, the way he articulated his understanding of Islam was very encompassing, very widespread, very grassroots oriented, of course, as you have mentioned. Is it that you would consider perhaps the most significant contribution, or the fact that he has given, if you will, like a new revive to the whole idea of Islam being a movement, in the sense that it extends beyond the books and theoretical and scholarly contributions. So I guess the question is it the practical side of him, or perhaps is the academic side of him that you would lean towards?
Yeah, so Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, rahimahullah, if you look at many of his ideas, most of his ideas, they're not original ideas. In other words, he was not somebody who was much of a, who was, sitting and thinking of brilliant solutions. He was rather somebody who was very traditionally trained, very broadly trained, very deeply trained, and was very, very smart. It's very clear from his, if you look at his, dissertation, his reception by other scholars. But his, I think, great gift was that he listened, he read, he learned, and he grew. So if you look at almost all of the ideas that I presented, other people had also presented them, but he combined them and he amplified them. And more importantly, he put them into conversation with, deeper conversation with Islam and the Quran and Sunnah and Islamic tradition. So for example, I can tell you about any number of dialogues and learning experiences he had. And I think that as such, he brought this wasatiya that he himself claimed, truly brought it. He brought this openness to being corrected and openness to learning and also correcting others. To give you a couple of examples, he was very fond of Shaykh Muhammad Al-Ghazali, who was his senior, and Muhammad Al-Ghazali was another Azhari, a very important, very outspoken, very smart scholar, a great da'i, and Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi looked up to him. But if you look at Shaykh Muhammad Al-Qaradawi's writings, Muhammad Al-Ghazali's writings, he dismissed Islamic history he had a very sharp tongue. So when he criticized somebody, he demolished him. That wasn't Qaradawi, right? So Qaradawi is slightly less interesting to read than Ghazali. Like if you're reading Ghazali, it's more interesting, more combative. But Shaykh Qaradawi actually wrote his book Tariq al-Muftar alayh to very gently critique his sheikh and mentor Muhammad al-Ghazali by saying, well, let's not go that far. Let's also look at the fact that there's so much good in our history. Similarly, Abu al-Mawdudi, rahimahullah, a great genius, who really, many of the original ideas, in fact, came from him. But he also, on some questions of whether it's the Hakimiyya and other things, Shaykh Qaradawi critiques him very politely. And if you will, brings him more into conversation with Islamic, with tradition. Similarly, Sayyid Qutb, for example, wrote a very important book in which he talks about the khasa'is, the special traits of the Tasawwur al-Islam, Islamic conception. And Sayyid Qutb's conception of Islam is almost entirely based in the ideas, aqaid, and theories of Islam, right? Where Shaykh Qaradawi wrote another book on the same topic, where he acknowledged his debt to Sayyid Qutb, but then said there's something very important Sayyid Qutb is missing, which is that he focuses only on theory and principles and generalities, but not on the Sharia and fiqh, the actual nitty-gritty and, if you will, Islam in the trenches. And so Shaykh Qaradawi's corrective of Sayyid Qutb is more balanced. It brings more nuance into the picture. So I think that, academically, Qaradawi did have this distinction that he learned from a lot of people. He was open to being corrected. He was also open to making mistakes. I mean, he would take courageous positions that people would find later questionable, or he would even correct. But also he corrected other people. And so you can learn a lot from this back and forth. So I think that academically, I appreciate that about him. Of course, he was also tremendously learned. There's no doubt about that. He wrote encyclopedic works on his very first book, his dissertation on fiqh al-zakat, and then he wrote on fiqh al-jihad. He gave also some very important fatwa about Hajj, to make Hajj easier, which were of course later implemented. At first they were resisted and rejected, but people realized what he was saying was going to be necessary to make certain allowances in Hajj. And similarly, the very last book that he wrote, which I haven't read, is Fiqh al-Salah. So he wrote important, large, big, erudite, scholarly treatises on all of these topics, but he also wrote pamphlets that are accessible to ordinary Arabic readers if they have the patience for learning.
There is another question here, Dr. Anjum, that says, what did he do early in his life that set him up for all of this?
I don't know if there's something early in his life other than the fact that he was ummatic. Why he was different from other scholars at Al-Azhar was that he was, he attended the halaqat of Hassan al-Banna, and he talks about how he was deeply influenced by that. One thing that I noticed about him is that he did not have arrogance. This is really remarkable. It's a big thing to say. It's easier said than done to not have arrogance, to say that, Imam Hassan al-Banna, rahimahullah, was not a great scholar. He was not a scholar. He was an outsider. He was a teacher, but he had charisma and love for deen and da'wah, whereas Qaradawi is Al-Azhar. He is a star at Al-Azhar. But despite that, he never shied away from acknowledging his debt, his total indebtedness to Hassan al-Banna, to a teacher, right? I think that he did that to many other people. This is just one example that, similarly, he would talk about other people correcting him and how he learned from them, including those that he disagreed with. So I think that I would say, as a young talib al-ilm, as young students, to have the willingness to learn from everyone, if you see the goodness in them, even if you don't fully agree with them, and acknowledge that. I think that was perhaps the reason that Allah blessed his legacy and his life so much. Wallahu a'lam.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Anjum, inshallah? It says here, would you say most ulama today are ummatic like he was?
Unfortunately, the ulama are divided. Many ulama are ummatic, but you see, they are obstructed. Their ummatic actions are obstructed often by their governments and by their circumstances. But he founded, of course, groups of ulama everywhere and met with them. So yes, I would say most of the ulama are ummatic, but those ulama that are ummatic are not the ones that are picked up by governments and put in important places and put on the media. So most ulama are ummatic, but those ulama are also often imprisoned or often in trouble. So that's why for a common person who does not know the ulama, he only or she only knows the TV ulama or the ulama that are propped up by the regimes, by the establishment, then you will have a bad impression of the ulama, because but it's not a unbiased sample, right? It's a very, very narrow picked sample of the ulama. That's not the true ulama. The true ulama, in fact, are much more likely to be ummatic, even if they don't have all the characteristics of Shaykh Qaradawi's openness and his global reach, and they still, nevertheless, if you tell them about the pains of the ummah and the duties that we have to the ummah, and they will think naturally beyond the concerns of their own nation state or their own ethnicity and own sect. Most ulama are like that, but I think that most ulama do not have the reach and perhaps the breadth of Shaykh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. He became an icon, I believe, a reminder to everyone of what it means to be an ummatic scholar. In fact, one thing that I should say is that there are ulama who, basically you have a very complex situation. You have a difficult situation in the Muslim world. And some ulama put their eggs, if you will, in the basket of some ruler. hoping that that ruler will bring Islam, or that group of rulers will bring Islam. Because that's what an alim wants. They want Allah's deen, and the prophets are ulama are heirs of prophets. So they want Islam. They might choose a ruler to do that, and they might say, okay, people may be wrong, and this hakim is right, this ruler is right, this president is right. However, when this ruler begins to oppose Islam and massacre people and go over to the enemies of Islam, then those people cannot stay silent, right? Shaykh Qaradawi was somebody, I think, who over time learned that he was going to put his eggs in the basket of the ummah. This was an ijtihad. He believed that the best chance of Islam coming back, of Islam being strengthened, Islam being successful, was that the masses of Muslims, even though they're not perfect, they're more difficult to corrupt than a small group of elites whose lives and whose power depends on foreign aid and foreign connections. So it was, you could say, an ijtihad. And if somebody makes an ijtihad and, backs a ruler, that's not in itself wrong. But if that same ruler begins to violate fundamental principles of Islam, and then you still back him, then you have lost what it means to be an alim and an heir or heirs of prophets. Shaykh Qaradawi, rahimahullah, I think his greatest distinction was that he had the wisdom to understand that the ummah, despite its flaws, is the best bet in this very complex struggle. The majority of Sawad al-A'zam, the majority of the ummah, are more likely to stick to Islam. Wallahu a'lam.
Ayatollah Muhammad, you have your hand raised, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
I just wanted to ask, just following up with the question, just quick advices for those of us, if you had students, for example, and who are passionate about pursuing the ummatic challenge from a foundational perspective of being broad and vast and relevant to the needs of the people, what methodologies would you recommend in pursuing it? Because today there's a dilemma of whether you should specialize or whether you should just keep going and following your passion. And generally, the skeptics would rather bet on being a specialist than to think in a Qaradawi fashion and push your luck and be very, very encompassing and end up still benefiting people. So how would you advise general students of knowledge as well as activist scholars who are thinking in that light and who may even end up even having spaces in poli-sci and different areas of the nation state? Thank you very much.
So I think that practically, to be a scholar, you have to specialize and you have to focus in some ways. It doesn't mean that you remain focused on that field and that subject or on that madhab throughout your life. But as a pedagogical structure, you need to focus on and learn to write about, learn to think about, learn to read the works from scholars in one area first. So that's a pedagogical advice. Shaykh Qaradawi was a faqih, right? So that actually he did have a grounding, that he was a Hanafi faqih. He was a Hanafi jurist. And that's why when you see his writings in theoretical issues like Aqidah, he's weaker in those. He doesn't, he's a generalist. He knows more than many of us put together, of course. Nevertheless, that wasn't his specialty. His specialty was fiqh. But that allowed him, nevertheless, to become a scholar and to learn to read. And that's true, I think, generally. Now, some people, like Qaradawi, become generalists after they have paid their dues, if you will. They write work on, like he wrote on fiqh al-zakat, and later he wrote on fiqh al-jihad. And he showed that he's reading all of these works, and in fact, he has many other researchers and friends and junior scholars working with him. So he remained engaged in scholarship, but he also wrote about many other issues. And sometimes he wrote about issues that one could say he didn't know enough about. So when he's writing about Muslims in the West, situation of Muslims in the West is changing, is evolving. And some of the things that he's writing, he doesn't quite know. He rather is depending on the informants, the people that are telling him what's happening in the West. I think that generalists have certain advantages and specialists have certain advantages, and it depends on what you want to do. The advantages that generalists have, after you have specialized in one field, then you can become a generalist. And the advantage is that generalists tend to be good leaders because they can have an overview of the entire field, overview of the world from various perspectives. And that tends to be good for leadership. That tends to be good in certain phases, if you will. When you establish universities, when you have, knowledge becomes more advanced, then you need more specialized people to advance that knowledge.
There's another question here in the chat that says, how can we get to know the other ulama or other ulama?
Yes, so I believe you're talking about how to get to know the ulama who are perhaps less known. I think that the best way to get to know other ulama is by knowing some ulama first, right? So when you become a student, even if you are a part-time student, you may be an engineer or a doctor or a businessman, but you become a talib al-ilm, you get to know some scholars. You will have first couple of years where you're just figuring out the terminology or just figuring out the basic principles. But you get to a point where you can read books, where you could figure out, okay, this is Usul al-Fiqh, this is Fiqh Hanbali, Fiqh Hanafi, Fiqh Maliki, these are the people who specialize in Aqidah and so on. And then you get to know people through them. Those are the ulama that you will get to know, of course, and it is you need discretion in figuring out which ulama are more, if you will, they live by what they say, right? That is always a judgment you will have to make. You don't have to agree with an alim to benefit from them, but also keep your thinking hat on. If an alim is not there at the Fajr prayer, the Isha prayer, if you know them personally, if an alim does not show taqwa on things on which there is no disagreement, then there is good reason to think that they may not have taqwa in things that you don't know enough about. So similarly, if an alim is backing positions that are leading clearly in your view, and your ijtihad could be wrong, but you're responsible for that ijtihad. That if an alim is leading to things, if they are suffering for haqq, they are more likely to be right. And if they are compromising, not merely one time, not for a greater good, but in ways that don't seem justifiable, be careful. So that remains a judgment that all of us have to make. And as you grow in your knowledge, your ability to make that judgment becomes better.
Are there any other questions? Anyone else who has a question, inshallah ta'ala, for Dr. Anjum? So it seems like we may be done with our questions, Dr. Anjum. So Jazakallah khair, barakallahu feek for the excellent presentation. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless you immensely, to continue to use you for the great work of the ummah, for Islam. And may He allow you to, mashallah, be a shining light in the world. And may Allah wa ta'ala bless you and your family with the highest level of paradise. Jazakumullah khairan to everyone for attending. May Allah always bless all of you as well. And mashallah, keep you all firm in your iman and in your love of Allah wa ta'ala. Ameen. With that, barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum.
If I could just say one last thing, if you want to find more of my writings and works, I founded an institute called ummatics.org. You will find some of my writings there, and inshallah, we're trying to collect the ulama and intellectuals who are ummatics or ummatic, ummah-centered there, inshallah. So you may follow us there. Jazakumullah khair.
barakallahu feekum. Jazakallah khair. طيب السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته إن شاء الله جزاكم الله خير.
Salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.